Welcome to the first English MURCIR talk in 2024. I'm Zuhal Mertuzuner. I'm the director of Marmara University Research Center for International Relations, and shortly we call it MURCIR. And MURCIR is a 30 years old research center in Marmara University and had been always an important platform to discuss contemporary developments in international relations. And Wednesday talks are a major part of these activities. By 2020, talks started to be existing in YouTube and other online platforms. And that made us much closer to the international community. And this event is also accessible from the YouTube account, as you can see from these technical difficulties. Today we have a very prominent guest speaker, dear Radmila Shekerinska. She is the former defense minister of North Macedonia and a former leader of the Social Democratic Union of Macedonia. Shekerinska was also previously Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration and National Coordinator for Foreign Assistance of North Macedonia, and also was acting in 2004 in Macedonian politics. She is the first female prime minister of North Macedonia, if I'm not wrong. And currently she is a member of the presidency of the Party of European Socialists. Today we are planning to discuss the changing geopolitical scope of the Balkans and the response of Balkan people, how we may deal with all these problems and challenges in front of us. Thank you, Mrs. Shekerinska. Accepting our invitation is so precious. And if you are ready, I may leave the floor to you to listen to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity, and good afternoon to everyone who, in spite of exams, has decided to join us. It's really difficult to talk about the Balkans and about geopolitical turmoil, because we in the Balkans have created enough turmoil and enough challenges for ourselves. So comparing them with the global challenges and global turmoil sometimes is kind of tricky. But although the Balkans is used to being the center of great power competition, I think most of the really critical issues have been very much born in the region. And when we assess the Balkans and the situation in the Balkans today, the assessment very much depends on our age. And let me tell you why this is so. I mean, maybe for someone who has been following the Balkans recently, one would presume that the Balkan is facing serious political challenges. But for me, who has been active in politics since the 90s, in the last century, I can see actually some good news and some bad news. The good news is, of course, that the Balkan is no longer the front page news. There is no ongoing war. The conflicts are seen as rather political games and not open confrontation. There are no reports of numberless casualties, and the situation seems rather calm. Nevertheless, there are also some bad news. And the bad news is that the challenges have become more complex in a way. So if you talk about the Western Balkans or the Balkans as a whole, you will see that especially the part that is still not member of the European Union, which is basically Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia, Albania, and North Macedonia, is going through a very similar pattern of polycrisis. The first challenge, the first part of this dangerous mix in terms of security, in terms of lost potential for prosperity, is of course that we still have several so-called frozen conflicts. The frozen conflict between Belgrade and Pristina, predominantly on the status of Kosovo, but also with regards to the Serbian minority in Kosovo, is probably the one that draws most attention. But there are also frozen conflicts like the one in Bosnia, which sees itself from time to time paralyzed due to these kinds of unresolved status issues. So I would say these kind of bilateral issues have been tormenting the Balkans for as long as I can remember. North Macedonia was stuck on its NATO path due to a name dispute with Greece. Currently, we are facing challenges on the EU path due to a problem with Bulgaria. Albania has been blocked from starting accession talks due to an open issue with Greece. So it becomes really a rather complicated issue, a rather complicated landscape. And this is just one part of the puzzle. So the frozen issues create fertile soil for many other problems. The second one being that the countries have witnessed enormous internal divisions. Most of the countries in the Balkans are very diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion, in terms of languages. And although it is sometimes a richness that we can use, unfortunately, we have ended up by constantly complaining about this diversity. And on top of this diversity, we have seen enormous something, the line was lost.
Yes, unfortunately, it can happen. These online platforms may not be so successful sometimes. No worries, we are still waiting your comments. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope I remember where everyone left. So on top of this, you still have the geopolitical games, the different geopolitical influences that actually strive in communities which are divided and utilize frozen conflicts. And on top of this rather volatile political situation, you have the duo of economic stagnation in the region and enormous brain drain. So in a way, there was a report by a renowned expert on the Balkans who says that the Western Balkan is kind of enriching the European Union because the level of brain drain and trade surplus is actually much larger than all the development aid coming from the European Union. And this myriad of challenges creates really a dangerous mix for the Balkans. You have the open issues, you have divisions within your own society, you have different geopolitical competitors taking advantage of these decisions, and in the same time you have a rather weak economy to sustain the development. And nevertheless, in my mind, the worst part of this mix is that the population in the Balkans has lost hope that the prospects given by the local political players and by the European Union for EU enlargement are credible and real. And this is creating a very, very serious handicap for policymakers, for politicians, but first and foremost for citizens. And this is why a very good expert on the Western Balkans, Ivan Krastev, has said when talking about the transition in the Balkans, that we have all moved from a repressive system in the 80s to a depressive society of the 21st century. I have been active in politics for more than 25 years. And I always believe when we talk about our challenges, our problems, our weaknesses, that we have to look to the mirror first. And we have to see what are the issues that depend solely on us. To come out of this dangerous mix of problems, challenges, and constant crisis, I do believe that the region needs to grow up and take responsibility for its own actions. Nevertheless, the example of North Macedonia is very telling that this is not enough. And I will try to use 5 to 10 minutes focusing on North Macedonia as an example why the region needs to show leadership, but also needs to ask for the same kind of credibility and responsibility by the EU. North Macedonia was a success story, one of the rare success stories in the Balkans twice. The first time it was in 2005, when we became the first candidate country after Croatia for EU membership. We have just moved from conflict. We have implemented a very difficult peace agreement, but we have shown that you can make important ethnic compromises while maintaining the support of your people. Macedonia then managed to really create the only functioning multi-ethnic state in the region, where several languages are in official use at a local level, where all different ethnic communities can strive to be represented in parliament, in government, but also in administration, and where a certain kind of power sharing agreement was not used to block the country, but to make it actually more cohesive. Unlike some of the examples in Bosnia, I think as a country, especially back in 2005, we have shown that interethnic respect, tolerance, and power sharing is a good method to develop your country. Unfortunately, due to some challenges that I have mentioned, the Greek veto afterwards in 2008 on our NATO membership really blocked that path. When we resumed our plan to become a member of NATO and EU back in 2017, we were confronted with an even more difficult challenge: how to deal with our open issue with Greece, how to improve our relationship with Bulgaria, which in the meantime became also a member of the European Union, and how to also improve the relationship between the two main ethnic groups, Macedonians and Albanians in the society. These three issues for Macedonian politics were considered to be the Bermuda Triangle. Whoever dares to deal with one of them dies in a political sense. Nevertheless, the government that was elected in 2017 has shown that with some courage, the right political leadership, you can actually improve all of them at once and in the same time maintain the support of your people. And really, we have moved forward solving the name dispute with Greece, which was not easy, which was criticized by many as an act of treason. It was used by many to steer even some violence on the streets, both in Greece and in what is now North Macedonia. But it did place Macedonia under the security umbrella of NATO. And this has been our strategic choice since the moment of our independence. So North Macedonia has become a member of NATO. And just as we were heading towards the start of accession talks, what happened was a delay of EU decision-making, which was not related to us. It was not related to Albania. It was not related even to the Balkans per se. It was because France and some other countries had issues or challenges with regards to enlargement. And they felt that the enlargement methodology needs to change and therefore delayed decision-making. I am mentioning this because I think it's one of those examples where a delay in decision-making, a hesitation on behalf of decision-makers can really guide events in a completely different direction. So our progress and our success was taken for granted then also. And I remember discussing this with some colleagues in France who said that they basically need not more than 6 months to reconfigure the EU enlargement methodology. And we were very open and very honest with them. We said, listen, we waited so long. We are not impatient for 6 months. But are you absolutely certain that everything else will stand still in those 6 months? They thought that we are just being typically Balkan pessimists. Unfortunately, it turned out that our pessimism was based on reality. And when the new EU methodology on enlargement was approved, Bulgaria changed its course. And they have decided de facto to veto us from starting accession talks. These were not hiccups in our enlargement path. These were serious risks and serious obstacles. And they have not only destroyed the strong EU support that North Macedonia always had among its citizens, they have also undermined EU leverage in North Macedonia, but also throughout the Balkans. I have heard a number of Balkan political leaders who were asked to solve some of the difficult political frozen conflicts in the last few years, use our example to justify the status quo. And they say literally, why should we tackle difficult bilateral frozen conflicts when we can look at the example of Macedonia? They have done everything. We have been very successful on the domestic front. Our reforms were assessed as very positive, very, very successful. We have solved problems that seemed unsurmountable. We have paid a certain political price for this. What did this lead? No enlargement also. So because of this, I say that this lost hope that EU credibility with enlargement is real might be one of the key handicaps for the region and one of the key handicaps for the EU influence and support in the region. This is why, although I expect the region, as I said, to grow up and take responsibility, I do believe that it is necessary that EU has to really revise its approach towards the Balkans in order to give more credibility to the EU enlargement process. I have participated to many discussions about whether enlargement has become geopolitical again. And I have heard several experts who referred to different conflicts, Middle East, and this was even before the new explosion of atrocities in the Middle East, who have mentioned the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And they said, how come the Balkans, in spite of all these problems, is still stable and at peace, while all these other conflicts the EU didn't manage to solve? And according to one of them, the prospect for enlargement, the future membership of the EU, has always acted as a certain kind of hope that prevented nationalists and populists to guide the Balkans into a full-fledged war. And I do agree. When the Russian invasion on Ukraine occurred 2 years ago, I think NATO and EU were quick to notice that the Balkans could be the next trigger point. And this is why it was very helpful that KFOR increased and fortified practically NATO's Balkan flank, including, I think, also Turkish troops. North Macedonia has increased its contributions. UK has sent more troops. And in the same time, EU has, I think, doubled its forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But just having this kind of security additions will never be enough unless EU becomes serious with regards to enlargement. Since the Russian attack on Ukraine, I think that there has been a clear more focus of the EU on enlargement. And unlike some of the EU skeptics in the past who saw enlargement towards the Western Balkans as a risk to EU's unity, now even these big skeptics say that the European Union needs enlargement for geopolitical relevance. There cannot be a sovereignty of the EU without the Balkans being included in the European Union. So there was this drive, this feeling that somehow EU has returned back to business, that enlargement is realistic, that there is a momentum, that there is a renewed opportunity. Nevertheless, having in mind our experience in the previous years, I think that there are still two different timetables. There is a rather long enlargement that does not produce real results. And then there are quick decisions which occur during war and during crisis, but which do not create certainty among the citizens and policymakers that they will be sustainable. Look at, I mean, the dramatic change in terms of enlargement is really unprecedented. In the matter of 12 months, Ukraine and Moldova not only got their candidate status, but they started accession talks. Bosnia followed suit. Georgia became a candidate country. All these things were considered impossible just 2 years ago. But the question is, will this go on? And will this be sustainable by us, the candidates, but also by the EU? Having in mind the recent results in the elections in Netherlands, where practically the only party who has not been favorable to enlargement came as a first-ranked party, and having in mind the increase of right-wing parties who have doubts about enlargement prior to European Parliament elections, I think that many experts in the Balkans, many politicians in the Balkans do have doubts whether this renewed optimism is going to stay. And the second question is, even if this is a new geopolitical era, even if this is a completely different world, can the old ways of enlargement actually produce the necessary result? And I think this is the big dilemma within the European Union. We have seen, I think the big challenge for the EU enlargement process in the Balkans was that EU enlargement stopped being transformational. I have been in the European process for too long. We all love the fact that you can pin the point that you are a member in the future. But actually what all of us aspire for is the instrument to transform our countries for the better. Without this transformative power, EU accession is not as attractive as it used to be. And if you analyze the situation in the different countries in the Balkans, you'll see that the accession was not transformative. It doesn't inspire politicians. It doesn't inspire civil servants. I ran the big EU team back in 2005 when we became a candidate country. The biggest privilege in that moment in the country was to be part of that team. It was considered to be the top of your career, the biggest advantage in your development, because everyone believed that they're doing something remarkable for their country. The country was changing and the progress was very visible. But right now, this kind of drive, this kind of inspiration has ceased to exist. And if you look at the numbers and if you look at the timeline, it is clear why. For example, Montenegro and Serbia have negotiated EU accession for 11 and 12 years. North Macedonia and Albania have just started last year. Is there any difference if you analyze the EU reports on accession on all of the 4 countries? You won't see dramatic differences, which means that the 1 decade-long accession talk for Montenegro and Serbia didn't help them transform the country. Of course, the transformation cannot be done by the EU. It has to be done by the local national actors, but still, you can see that somehow we are turning circles. And this kind of delayed accession talk, and I shouldn't speak about a delayed accession talk to Turkey and to Turkish participants, but when you compare the present Balkan experiences with the experience of the last member of the EU, which is Croatia, which negotiated and became a member in 68 months, it's really a huge discrepancy. All of the experts, all of the decision makers in the time of the Eastern enlargement towards Central and Eastern Europe have proven that the only thing that works for enlargement is if you have a target date for membership, and if you have a competition between the candidates. And in the case of the Balkans, you don't have even the target date, because it was really difficult to talk about these things with the EU even 10 years ago. Now we are talking about the possibility of joining the EU in 2030, but even this was only seconded by the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and not the other representatives of EU institutions. Not having this kind of target, which should not be a full promise, but should be an offer to Balkan countries, makes the Balkan efforts weaker. It makes the politicians who talk about EU enlargement appear weaker. It makes citizens more cynical, and it creates a new danger for the Balkan. If we don't wake up to this new reality, there is a real danger that the Western Balkan will become a double periphery. On one side, it will be the periphery of the EU as it is now, but it might become even the double periphery of the enlargement process. Because with the introduction of Ukraine and Moldova and potentially Georgia to the accession talks, and with the clear focus on Ukraine and Moldova because of the security challenge there, the Western Balkans might lose even that race. And this is really a risk of turning accession into an endless and completely unproductive process. I am a firm believer that EU conditionality is our best friend, both for us in the Balkans, but also for the EU as our partner. But the conditionality works only if there are two things at least: a genuine political will on behalf of both sides, Balkans and Europeans, and if there is a reliability of the process. This is what worked in the case of Eastern Europe. Today we talk about geopolitical enlargement, but if we are fair, we will say that every enlargement that worked in the past worked because it was geopolitical. Spain, Portugal, and Greece became members of the European Union not because of Copenhagen criteria, but because of geopolitics. Eastern Europe managed to go through the transition because everyone saw the geopolitical opportunity. And the problem is that we often forget the things that we once knew. So although this seems like a no-brainer, as if as the Americans would say, that you need these two things. You need the political commitment, you need the political will, but you also need to count on the EU word. Sometimes we forget these lessons. And sometimes also some of the Balkan actors have played the same game, using EU lack of reliability to be unreliable themselves. So this kind of blame game has practically wasted us a whole decade. This is why I do believe that the EU has to repeat what it does well. Clear EU enlargement perspective, fast track on enlargement to those that meet the criteria, but also maintain a strong focus on rule of law. Because without these three elements, the enlargement will not lead to improved Balkans, but only towards a weakened European Union. Sometimes Balkan has all the attention that it requires, right? For all the wrong reasons. When the conflict in the north part of Kosovo occurred, suddenly everyone started paying attention again to the Balkans. We are not the only ones who suffer like this. I mean, if you look at the situation, the horrible situation in the Middle East now, you'll see the same thing. we were all aware that frozen conflicts are never frozen, that they just need one small sparkle, and in this case it wasn't even small, to reignite. But we should not wait for the same reminder for the Balkans, because basically what we have seen in the 90s is that what happens in the Balkans rarely stays just in the Balkans. It spreads. I remember my discussions in the 90s with some of my European colleagues. They were shocked by the wave of nationalism. They were appalled by the big ethnic linguistic divisions. They were shocked that identity politics dominates our political arena. But if you look at Europe now, you'll see the same elements: nationalism, divisions, identity politics, all of it fueled also by disinformation, by fake news, by geopolitical competition. So these kind of toxic combinations, toxic fluids are very dangerous to keep intact. And this is why the EU engagement in the Western Balkans has to be, on one side, active. It has to be sustained. It cannot go from one crisis to the other, but it also has to be genuine and reliable, because the Balkan is not famous for being reliable. But this time, I think that we have proven that whenever there is a political will in the Balkans, you can see the results. But we cannot do this alone. And this is why the present global challenges with two global wars, two regional conflicts with global ramifications, let's be more precise, the problem with climate change, the post-pandemic economic struggles, the lack of energy supply, the rising costs throughout the world, all these things are making our world less secure, more prone to crisis, and also less predictable. So we have to close down on the gray zones, and dealing with frozen conflicts and giving some perspective to countries that have performed well is crucial. The Balkan always suffered that African curse, that when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. So on top of our homebred problems, we have often felt the consequences of geopolitical competition. The time has come now to use, let's say, the global actors, and especially the EU, with more constructive engagements in the Balkans. And what remains is, of course, to have the dedication, the commitment, and the courage of domestic political players to do their job. I have always been a firm believer that you cannot expect help from elsewhere if you don't try to improve your situation with your own means. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you for this inspiring speech. I'm sure the participants may have several questions. I would like to underline some important points you referred, especially these frozen conflicts became very dangerous for the world order and peace today. It is sure what we observe in Gaza is so tragic, unfortunately. So the cases in Balkans have such, let's say, delicate situations. And as you mentioned, the frozen conflict understanding is not anymore working. So this is the one point what is very striking for me in your speech. Another one is also related with this, the expansion of this, the problematic zone, because we know that Balkans had been always a transitional zone between different actors. So when we compare with the other regions, it was always like this. So it was considered always like a kind of buffer. But now we observed with the Ukrainian war, this transitionary zone extended and you were somehow shifted into a much more inner circle. So there is a kind of opportunity window, very clear and observable for the Balkan people for the EU membership. But on the other side, as you mentioned, it is geopolitical calculation. It had been always, and there are some other matters. Maybe I should stop here to give the floor to our participants. We have professors from our department and from other universities. Would you like to ask any question? I may leave the floor. Okay, can you open the voice? Okay, it must work now.
Thank you very much. My name is Mehmet Uğur Ekinci. I'm a researcher on Balkan politics. And thank you very much, Ms. Shekerinska, for your intervention. It was quite interesting to hear your opinions. I have two questions to you. One is a question that always occupies my mind, because whenever geopolitics is discussed in the context of Balkans, the most dominant theme that we are hearing is EU membership. And I understand how important and relevant matter this is for Western Balkan countries. But the logic of EU membership is very much in connection with satisfying EU criteria. And there is a chicken and egg problem, as you mentioned, I mean, like going for decades as a blame game between EU and local actors. But if there's a fast track without enough alignment, then do you think that all these complex problems, complex challenges will go away with EU membership, or whether these complex challenges become a larger matter for European Union? This is my first question. So is it going to cure these problems, the membership? The second question is, could you assess the outcomes of NATO membership of North Macedonia? Looking backwards, I mean, what are the concrete outcomes in terms of logistics and political and even psychological effects? Is it matching with the expectations of you as a former politician, as a minister, or in the eyes of the public? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting questions. And I'll actually start with NATO, because then I think there was a sharp contrast between how NATO responded and how the EU delayed the response. Our NATO membership has been a source of frustration for several political generations, let's say. We were seen as a front runner from the Balkans back in 2005. I remember it was Albania, Croatia, and Macedonia that formed together with the US a so-called Adriatic Charter, pushing the three countries towards NATO membership. And according to most US experts, we were the front runner. We were the ones actually pushing Croatia and Albania forward. This is because we have been spared the Yugoslav wars, and because we have had a very strong military cooperation with both the US in the 90s and with Turkey. And most of our military personnel really did receive excellent training by both the US and Turkey predominantly, in a way paving the way towards our membership. And when the veto from Greece happened, basically we saw the Albania and Croatia moving forward and we were stuck. So on one side, it was, as you said, psychologically very important that we showed that our strategic goals can be met. The price was not small. I mean, even today, several years after the implementation of the Prespa agreement, it is still difficult for us to say that we had to change our constitution and our name to do this. Nevertheless, even the people who have been skeptical about the Prespa agreement with Greece, they appreciate also membership in NATO. And this was the case during COVID. This was the case, especially after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, when at a psychological level, people felt relieved that they are not seen as the borderline. They belong somewhere. They're part of a wider, let's say, security umbrella. I remember during the COVID pandemics, where we had to limit most of our interactions, we celebrated together with some of the NATO ambassadors the first flyover of NATO planes over Skopje. And people were at home and they were depressed, and we were wondering whether this is the right thing to do. But we said, okay, let's do something. I'm an optimist by nature, but even I was pleasantly surprised by how people said, okay, I feel as if we are not just alone. I feel we belong to something bigger. And that was not only at a level of psychology and at a level of political assessment. It did have a serious effect over our economy. Even in difficult times, like during COVID and during the war, we have seen incredible increase of foreign investments. We have seen an empowered and an emboldened domestic investors. And most of them, and including the credit rating agencies, have always referred to NATO membership being seen as the reason for this renewed interest and ambition. When you explain your country coming from the Balkans, history of conflict, when you say we have open issues with two of our neighbors, you have a very diverse country with a history of ethnic divides and even conflict, the investors do not run to you. So presenting yourself as a member of the greatest military alliance does affect economy, and it does affect politics. At a different level now, as a defense minister, NATO membership has been a Christmas gift to everyone who has worked in security and defense. Yes, we have increased our defense spending, but people saw that this is not just a package of money going to Brussels or going to NATO. It was basically money that we invested in our personnel, who are extremely satisfied, who are better trained, who travel abroad, who participate at different missions. So it was also, I think that for small nations, I mean, you cannot understand this, for small nations, this gives a sense of pride and accomplishment. And I think that this is important for any aspiring nation. And I think it's very good for the economy, it's very good for politics. So I think that NATO membership has been timely, it has matched expectations, and it has secured us, especially in times of a very volatile geopolitical situation. On the EU accession, I fully agree with you. I have never believed that the EU accession is, let's say, a second type of Christmas gift. Here you are, and now suddenly with this magic wand, all your deficiencies will disappear. That's naive, that's irresponsible, and that's utterly wrong. What I do believe when I say fast track, I said fast track plus strict conditionality, especially in the area of rule of law. One without the other would not work. The problem, I remember the first visit I had to the European Commission back in 2002. We were just a country emerging from ethnic conflict, but we were a new government that looked very optimistic and very pro-European. And we had a great meeting with the leadership of the Commission. And when some of the journalists asked them, how do you see this new Macedonian government? They said, well, they look great at first sight, but let's see whether they'll deliver. But what they told us internally is what I always remembered, that the European Commission will be your strict but fair partner. And they were strict but fair. And when we delivered reforms back in 2005, the European Commission was strict but fair in saying that we have earned a candidate status. The problem is that in these kinds of processes, it doesn't end with the European Commission. Then you need the endorsement of all member states, and they might have an open issue which has nothing to do with conditions. It can have nothing to do with your accomplishments. It can sometimes have, it is sometimes connected with domestic circumstances, like in 2005, the French referendum, or the Dutch also failed referendum. And it is because of this that EU has lost its leverage in the Balkans. That even when the countries delivered, like in our case, there was yet another problem. And the citizens started wondering whether the EU is really interested in enlargement. And when you look at EU debates, you'll see that there are big political groups within the European Union that do believe that the EU should not continue to enlarge. There are groups now that say that in order to enlarge, the EU needs to reform itself. It's all a bit complicated. It has become a multidimensional chess. But I believe that the old recipe, strict but fair, and reward when reward is earned, works. Not because the membership will solve our problems, but because striving for membership will make us better. And of course, let us not be naive. It is also a question of money. I mean, currently, all Macedonian companies are competing at the European market. And they're not protected. We have a very, very efficient trade and very open trade arrangement in which competition is very difficult for most of our companies, but they survive somehow. And in the same time, they cannot count on the support that Bulgarian companies have, or Greek companies in our neighborhood have. So we are telling them swim, but actually they're swimming with one of their hands and one of their legs tied. And this is why delivering EU membership, especially on access to European structural and cohesion funds, is not just a political expectation. It's not just talk. It's not just perception. It's also access to resources which are already available to European countries. So I also think we need to be very pragmatic about these things.
Thank you. I see two questions. Maybe we may take both of them and you may answer together. Okay, Ramazan Hocam, buyurun.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I am very grateful for your excellent presentation. Thank you very much. My question is on your answer to Ekinji's question on NATO issue. I was a little bit puzzled by your, how can I say, sympathetic response to Macedonia's membership into NATO. As a socialist, ideologically speaking, how would you reconcile this matter with your socialist background? From this perspective, maybe I can a little bit enlarge the question. In my opinion, on European matters, from EU members to Balkans, to now even to Ukrainian matters, I see a deep, what you mentioned, frozen conflict between the United States of America and European Union. So-called what we know this, Europeanists and the transatlanticists division. For example, from this perspective, Turkey's lack of membership or failure of membership into European Union is totally, but I underline the adverb, totally related with Turkey's Atlanticist position. So if you look at from a general perspective, as a socialist, don't you think United States of America is big problem for European integration matters. For example, I am just a bit enlarging the issue, sorry for that. For example, Ukraine issue. Ukraine issue could be resolved by peaceful means. I am of this opinion. It could be resolved by EU methods, European Union peace methods. But what happened? United Kingdom, United States of America, namely the transatlantists, provocated the Ukrainian matter into this position. I don't want to go into this problem. So you understand what I mean? So from this perspective, how do you see American presence or American intervention into European Union policies, including enlargement? I hope you understood my question. Thank you very much.
And Ibrahim Mazlum, please.
Thank you very much, Zuhal Hocam. Ms. Shekerinska, thank you very much for this very detailed, informative speech. I would like to raise a question about the issue that you have highlighted before at the beginning of the speech, the brain drain issue. I mean, we have been here talking about, as you know, geopolitical dynamics. And as you would know, one of the dimensions of the geopolitical power is economic power as well. I mean, and also the quality population as well. So what we have been observing until now from the enlargement process in the Balkans, personally, for example, because of my family matters, I know Bulgaria, there have been really very strong brain drains. I mean, the population right now is very much aging. In the villages, you cannot find, you know, the youngster people, even as the farmers or as the industrialists, for example. I mean, it is getting really a big problem about that. So what I would like to ask is this. While, I mean, in the case of the new members and the new enlargement process of the Balkans into the EU would be able to geopolitically empowered because of that, you know, entrance of the new members. But I fear that the new members would be not empowered but weakened in terms of this, you know, because of this brain drain issues. So what do you think about that? I mean, by looking to the previous cases, how you anticipate the potential feature in these terms with these new potential members of the EU? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for these both difficult questions within questions. Let me start with NATO. And I'll have to say that I am biased in a way because I am a social democrat who has gone through war. And this is why I'm neither naive nor dogmatic in those things. By the way, the first time I remember NATO during the Kosovo War, if I'm not mistaken, it was a socialist running it, Solana, the Spanish socialist, with some up and down in his comments about the conflict. In the case of Macedonia, and in the case of several countries in the Balkans, if you analyze their political structures, you will see that NATO was never part of the left-right divide. On the contrary, in the case of North Macedonia, this was probably NATO and EU were probably the only two things where conservatives and progressives agreed on. We have had different views what would work. We have had different views how to get there. But when it comes to goal, this was certain. And I'm really grateful for this, because in very diverse and divided countries, you need this thing that unites you. And let's say Macedonia, you have Albanians. Macedonians have always been pro-NATO, Albanians, Turks, because of Turkey also. Practically every ethnic group, every language group, every religious community has been pro-NATO. And in a way, this is probably because of the 90s. Because in the times of former Yugoslavia wars, NATO was still seen as a certain kind of guarantee. This is where you want to belong. Most of our people leaving the country, they go to the West. They go to NATO and EU member states. So this was never part of the ideological fight. Actually, social democrats in Macedonia have always been more successful in moving the country closer to NATO than the others. But let me also address the more challenging issue on Ukraine. And on this, I will be very, very open and blunt. I don't believe, and I will tell you why, I don't believe that the war in Ukraine has been provoked by the US and the UK. I don't believe this, because it was not the UK and the US that were creating the Russian narrative vis-a-vis Ukraine in the last 10 years. And I'm extremely sensitive to this narrative because as a Macedonian, I have also experienced it. I mean, it was not only before the recent attacks, it was also before 2014 that Putin has talked about a non-existent Ukrainian nation, right? It wasn't the US, it wasn't the UK. It was Russian ideologues that have been full of stories about how actually Ukraine is the birthplace of the Russian nation. Very similar to how certain Serbs are referring to Kosovo, but also very similar. This is why I might be biased. This is how certain Bulgarian politicians refer to Macedonians. It's as if certain nations have the right to give you the sense of identity, and certain nations should just accept reality. I as a socialist, I'm a firm believer that we do possess rights for self-determination, and we do possess the rights to have our territorial integrity protected by international law. So I was present at some of the NATO meetings. I heard the story that the reason why Russia attacked allegedly Ukraine is because Ukraine would have become a NATO member state. As someone who has been present at various NATO meetings, let me tell you that Ukraine stood no chance of becoming a NATO member before the Russian attacks. And all these narratives were a preparation for war. The attack in 2014 was a preparation for this war. And if anyone in NATO would have wanted to use a Russian aggression to start the war, they would have used it in 2014. But there were still people and countries that hoped that peace is a better option. When you start attacking the country full frontal, including their capital, including the whole border, talking about peace will not help you, unfortunately. And talking about a peace prospect and talking about someone else who provoked this is not helpful. You have to protect, you have to defend, you have to fight, unfortunately. So I believe that the question of EU defense sovereignty is an issue that's interesting to discuss. But I don't believe that it was this dispute that provoked the conflict in Ukraine. On the contrary, I do believe that the war of Ukraine is actually making all these discussions even more important in the present circumstances. Macedonia is seen also as very Atlanticist, so probably this could be seen as a minus in certain headquarters. But this discussion within the EU has been going on for quite some time. And I think it's not the only discussion within the EU. I mean, look at the discussion about the Lisbon Treaty changes. Look at the discussion about quality majority vote. This is how complicated entities such as the European Union exist and develop. Every 10, every 20 years, there are discussions about a new architecture within the European Union. Many people see this as the EU weakness. I do believe it also creates its resilience. And every time that we would see a doomsday scenario saying that EU will collapse, well, EU has managed to move forward. And I think that's a good thing. Their cooperation in the area of defense has increased, but also EU investment in defense has increased. And the real discussions, actually, that most Europeans these days have is what will happen with our defense cooperation at a transatlantic level after the elections in the US. Will this pivot the US more towards the Pacific, and will the focus on Europe still remain? And all of these are difficult challenges, but as someone who has suffered under also Russian narrative, I dismiss the comments that Russia's soldiers and Russian generals attacked without any remorse their neighbors, violating all international law, just because they were worried about NATO and EU and US and UK. I simply don't buy it. Let me tell you our example. We have announced our desire to join NATO since our independence, since the 90s. We have never had any Russian official talk and address these issues, neither during the 90s nor during the beginning of this century. It wasn't until 2014 that Russia started paying attention to Macedonia. And after 2014, we have seen their behavior change. And what we saw during our negotiations with Greece on the Prespa agreement is a very direct attempt to undermine the possibility of a compromise, only because they knew that it would mean our potential NATO membership. They didn't try that hard in Macedonia because their influence was limited at that time. But they have really tried to pressure corrupt members of parliament in the Greek parliament to prevent the Prespa agreement from happening. And I do believe that this was hostile, and that I do believe that this was against the solution of frozen conflicts and the development of the Balkans. What we have seen afterwards was their attempt also to use certain Bulgarian politicians to prevent us from progressing in EU affairs. These kind of malign influences are not some storybook. These are not stories. These are not imagined things. These are issues that we have struggled with firsthand. And this is why I not only sympathize with Ukraine after seeing the atrocities and the violence and the victims, I sympathize with them because at a much lower extent, we have gone through this painful experience of being denied, being neglected, and also trying to be obstructed. And I don't believe that there is justification for this.
Thank you.
On the second, I just didn't know. On the second question, this is actually, I fully agree with you that this will be this is the challenge now for North Macedonia. It will be more of a challenge when we join, because the freedom of movement will mean that some of our citizens will have absolutely no problem in getting a job in Europe. The only issue that you have to take into account now for North Macedonia is that even today, without being a member, because of the fact that the European market is very eager to attract workers, especially in certain industries, and the fact that our citizens can easily get passports from different countries, especially from Bulgaria, some of them from Croatia, they manage. Those who want to leave the country find a way, because the European market is very open and very hungry. It was not like this 20 years ago. It was almost impossible to leave, even to go for studies. But now Slovenian universities have presentations in Skopje trying to attract Macedonian students to move and study there. Once they study in Ljubljana or Maribor, they stay there. And the only way that we can counter this problem is by creating a better country here. Because most of the people who are leaving are not leaving because they just want to earn a lot of money. They want a better, more predictable, more secure lifestyle, better opportunities for them and their children. If we cannot match these expectations, they will leave. If they don't leave for the EU, they'll leave for Canada, Australia, or the US. But I agree with you. We are basically in a race with time. Whether we will improve our country quicker than this brain drain tendencies. But the toll is already very high. And Croatia was going through the same ordeal. Poland was going through the same ordeal. But 10 years after membership, they have seen also a reverse trend. Certain people who have earned money, who have been successful in businesses, they started coming back with some of that money and some of those investments. As I said, I know it's actually not a safe bet, but without improving the economic opportunities, having in mind how small our market is, we actually cannot compete with the EU, not only in terms of products, but also in terms of manpower and in terms of brain.
Hocam, can I ask a very short question? Yes or no question? No.
Very short, because we have
Very short. Ms. Shekerina, sorry,
Shekerinska.
for the pronunciation. Just short answer, yes or no, if you like. Do you think, in your opinion, European Union is weaker or more powerful after Ukrainian war?
In terms of politics, in terms of economy?
European impact on world affairs, European impact on European affairs, whatever you consider.
When you have a war on your continent, you suffer. When you have a shattered security architecture, you suffer. You cannot move and become stronger. But actually, if you look at global circumstances, I cannot see someone who is actually becoming stronger after the crisis. It's very volatile. And the question is, how will we change after the crisis? What has been seen as positive is that the EU is now economically less dependent on just one energy supplier. And I do believe that with the green plan and the transformation, the green transition, European Union will become more resilient in that field. I do believe that the European Union has become more serious about its defense also, but it's still in the making. It's like asking how will the world turn out in the midst of the Second World War? It is still very unpredictable. And it's not just now the war in Ukraine. The Middle East conflict is challenging everything that we knew about security, about the international world order. And it is in times like this that the new architecture has to be developed. And EU will have to play a large role in this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. There is another question. I know we are a little bit extended for our the time space, but I want to ask that question. Ahmet Serdar Zulfikar wrote in our chat box, and he asked, I wonder how is the relationship between Albanians and Macedonians today? And I also wonder if there is any threat alive from Albanian separatist organizations in Macedonia.
Well, you know, in 2003, 2004, in the 90s, this was the starting and the ending point of every meeting that we've had with internationals. How are the inter-ethnic relations in Macedonia? And this was seen as a make or break issue for the country, rightfully so. I do believe that countries like North Macedonia always have to pay attention to its inter-ethnic relations. But I think it's a testament to our progress and to a certain extent to our success that this is no longer the first and last question. I sometimes am angry that some of our European colleagues actually do not pay attention to these issues. North Macedonia has certain advantages. Because we are diverse, sometimes we turn out to be more resilient than many people predicted. When the conflict started in 2001, many people predicted that Macedonia will fall apart. It did not. And I think that especially after 2017, we have created a more cohesive society. But when you have a diverse society, you cannot say, okay, we solved those issues, because these are daily issues. You have to constantly convince people in all ethnic communities that their rights are protected. I think that years ago, the representatives of the ethnic Albanian community felt that their voice does not count enough, that they're sidelined. Nowadays, certain ethnic Macedonians believe that their voice has been silenced. So this is a constant political work. It's a work in construction in the making. But I believe that we have shown that when you have several languages that are being used, that this is not the end of your state. When you have different communities represented in your administration, this is not the end. For example, 2 days ago, we have seen the election of a first ethnic Albanian prime minister of the government of North Macedonia. And many people see this as an accomplishment. Many people see this as a risk. Although it is a caretaker government that will only prepare the country for the elections that will take place this spring, nevertheless, it is a remarkable change. And this is why I would say that the relationship has improved, but the challenges remain. I don't believe that the plans of creating great Albania or great Serbia will be successful. I think that citizens, even political parties, mainstream political parties, have seen this as the main weakness. People want to talk about how do they solve their economic troubles, how do they solve their social challenges, how do they see more opportunities for citizens. Many people were worried about the census in North Macedonia that has been delayed for 10 years. Finally, 2 years ago, we have managed to conduct the census. And what we have seen is that nothing dramatic happened, also because Macedonians have left the country, Albanians have left the country, Turks have left the country because they want to look for better opportunities for their families. And instead of talking about great states, we do talk about Berlin process. We do talk about open Balkan. I really liked the open Balkan initiative, although it had its disadvantages. It only had 3 countries. But after a history of divisions, you had the Serbian president, an Albanian prime minister, and a Macedonian prime minister sitting down and saying, how can we open borders? How can we improve cooperation? Not because EU has asked us to talk, but because we know that it is through regional cooperation and better good neighborly relations that we can solve problems. I think it was a signal of maturity, or at least as an optimist, I wish to to consider it as a sign of maturity.
Thank you for your valuable contribution. I say this to our the guests, and dear Radmila Shekerinska, we are so happy to host you in our the MURCIR talks. It was a wonderful presentation. We hope to be in cooperation the next years, months again to see you here. Thank you. So this is the end of the first Wednesday talk in English, and we will continue to organize English events. So please follow us by using our social media accounts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.